time to change the way that legal services are delivered. And many of you, I know, will have views and questions on this, as we do. I'm Jennifer Swallow, Director of LawTech UK, which is a government-backed initiative to help the legal sector transform through technology, ultimately to better serve business and wider society. And nothing of our discussion today reflects government policy. I'll hand over in a moment to Richard Susskind, who's kindly chairing the event for us today. Richard will be known to many of you, and we're very glad to have him with us. He has spent much of his life advising and writing and discussing the topic that we are to cover today. Richard is also a member of the LawTech UK panel. And speaking of panel, we have a great lineup of panelists for you today, and Richard will introduce them to you in a moment. And the panel welcome your questions. We're going to leave time for those at the end, so please do submit them. You'll be able to see at the bottom of your screen a little Q&A button. So just hit that. Please remember to include your name. I will review them and I will come in at the end to ask them on your behalf. So handing straight over to Richard to chair the discussion and get us underway with thanks.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. Legal services after COVID-19. Self-interest or public interest? Is it time to change the way legal services are delivered? That's the subject matter of today's discussion, and we've assembled, I think, a formidable team to address these tricky issues. Can I introduce them to you now? Rosemary Martin, who's General Counsel of Vodafone, one of the most prominent clients in the UK and worldwide, and a member of the LawTech UK panel. We also welcome Judy Perry Martinez, who's president of the American Bar Association. A particularly warm welcome to you because I know it's very early in the morning. We have Jerome Auerhand, who's the global senior partner of Clifford Chance. And finally, we have Gina Miller, known to many of you, the eponymous Gina Miller cases that went to the Supreme Court. But Gina is also here because she brings the perspective of someone from another profession, that of wealth management. So those, ladies and gentlemen, are your panelists. What I'd like to do is ask each of them, as it were, to set out their stall, to give us their worldview on COVID and legal services after COVID-19. And we hope the after comes much sooner than later. I wonder if we could start, as we all always ought to in these discussions with the client. Rosemary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Certainly what we're seeing in our company around COVID is speed, a real increase in the need for speed. And we're seeing that also being reflected in the courts. Now that a lot of courts are practicing in a virtual way, we're seeing a lot of change in practice. We're seeing quite a lot of relaxation of a lot of the formality around courtrooms. And I think that relaxation is probably helpful in the context of business disputes and business matters. I think it probably raises some questions in relation to family law and more personal issues where perhaps still that ability to be able to see people in the flesh and really interact with them as human beings in person is still very important. But we're seeing law firms reacting rapidly to our needs as well. So I would say we're seeing focus on the real issues, a falling away of less important issues, and a real increase in speed. And all of those, I think, are to be welcomed from a business perspective.
Thank you very much. Can we cross the pond and ask Judy the same question? What's your take so far? Why don't we go while you're controlling the volume? Oh, no, you're with us. Excellent. I was going to turn over to someone else. But Judy, yes, your thoughts so far.
Well, I think similarly to Rosemary, we are experiencing a remarkable transformation and change in terms of the acceptance of what needs to happen, both within the profession and the courts with regard to serving clients and those who need legal services. Frankly, we're seeing the courts demonstrate leadership in terms of giving way, if you will, to many of the particularly historic and traditional ways of doing business. Some courts are doing more than others, but they are taking up the very important role of leading in that regard. What we've seen in lawyers is that they have demonstrated as well significant ability to absorb technology in a way that they never have, whether they be a large firm or a solo practitioner. And what we know is that they have to adapt in a way that is sustainable. And that does bring challenges. It is bringing challenges. And that's where significantly bar associations and others can really help them lead through and beyond this pandemic. Most importantly, I think that we have is a new keen awareness to our responsibility as individual lawyers, as well as to our responsibility of the legal profession as a whole, to listen and to hear what consumers of justice want, how they want to gain access to legal services, no matter if they're a small business, a large corporation, or an individual. And I think, frankly, that ear to the ground, which we really haven't had a sense of doing as well as we should before, is probably the most remarkable thing that I've seen so far in terms of changes that have come about in the US.
Thank you for that, Judy. Jerome, you are the helm of one of the largest professional firms in the world. How is the world looking from your angle?
Well, Richard, thank you very much. And many of the same things that Judy and Rosemary were speaking about, we're seeing. But I think if we were investing heavily in innovation and the way we delivered our services as we went into the crisis, so we were well positioned. But what we're, I think, all seeing in the client demand is really an expectation of innovation. So where before this, we were doing a lot, but the expectations were sort of more measured now. And as we heard from Rosemary at Vodafone, there is a great expectation of speed of delivery, efficiency of delivery. So that's all ramping up tremendously fast. And I think the question is whether law firms will, in this period, continue to invest in this, and I think they definitely should, and I think that is a key priority. So I think we're seeing that. So the innovation and the scaling of the new and the pivoting to the new accelerating very rapidly. We also had a few comments around remote courts and virtual hearings, etc. We are seeing a lot of that. I did a quick survey in our global litigation practice yesterday in preparation for today, just to get feedback from partners and senior lawyers. And generally, the experiences are very positive. I know you've got your website, remote courts, which actually sets out the differences per country. But we really see, particularly in Australia, in the common law countries, a lot of take up. In some of the more formalistic countries, maybe like Spain and others, I think there's a slightly bigger adaptation. We see some courts using sometimes slightly outdated technology platforms. So I think there's a risk of everyone trying to invent the wheel, and it would be good to come to sort of common standards as much as possible. It's interesting, for example, a country like India, I was being told, where you might not, and that's probably a bias on my part, but might not expect that as much. That has really also taken up a lot of virtual hearings and actually is working away some of the notorious backlog in the Indian court systems because of it. But there the challenge is the smaller and medium-sized firms to have the IT platform. So there's a risk of inequality arising there. On remote courts, just a brief comment one partner made to me, which I thought was an interesting analogy. He said it's like maybe like losing a limb. He had spoken to an orthopedic surgeon. He said apparently the experience when you lose a limb is that at first you're in shock. Then there's a positive period when you suddenly start to realize that with medical support, etc., there's a lot you can still do. And then in the third phase is really when the disappointment sets in of what you've lost. And okay, this is just one particular view, but he said we seem to be in the second phase now, that we are realizing how much we can do with technology, how efficient it is, how much time and cost we can save. But at the same time, are we going to go to phase number 3, where we're going to, when the pendulum swings back a bit, when we realize there's also a lot that we lose because of it. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but I thought that was an interesting analogy. And then the last point I would make maybe on technology side is, we see a more rapid implementation of artificial intelligence and algorithms. And there is a concern on our part sometimes that some of the technology that gets implemented is not really mature enough and maybe gets implemented too quickly. So could that have a backlash? And also with respect to artificial intelligence, and we may touch on that in a further discussion, there's obviously the risk of bias creeping in. So those are areas that we watch carefully. So maybe I should stop there, Richard.
No, thank you very much. That was great. For those of us who've been advocating online courts for many years, we probably would argue it's like adding a limb rather than taking away a limb. And thank you also for mentioning, and I want to give you the URL, remotecourts.org is the site that Lawtech UK has been involved in setting up. And from that site, you'll see stories from 56 different countries who are embracing technology in their courts because there's no option. Some people call it innovation by constraint. Other people say necessity is the mother of invention. But frankly, if we're to keep the wheels of justice going, we've had to adopt some kind of remote court infrastructure. Gina, over to you finally by way of introduction. What are you thinking about the way in which the legal system might have developed? And interestingly, I hope from your own perspective as someone who's in another profession, how is that adapting?
Yes, thank you so much, Richard, and the rest of the panelists. And I have to say, I agree with all that's been said, but I just want to pick up on some of the things that Jerome said from the point of view of being the founder of one of the first online digital wealth platforms back in 2014. And there are benefits of embracing technology to satisfy the trends that we see that are coming out of COVID and the pandemic period. But they're not new issues, and mindsets were already shifting towards enabling technology. And I think one of the things that the pandemic is doing is accelerating those expectations of around two particular areas. One is accessibility and the other one is affordability. And I would say that the legal profession, a bit like the investment profession, has underserved the market because it has become too expensive, too remote, and this feeling that there is a trust deficit there. And technology can address all of those things, and we have found that. But I would say it does require a changing of mindsets, because it tends to be conversations I've had both in the investment world and the legal profession is this idea that it's either or, and it's not, it's complementary. And what we have found is that technology enables you to diversify your client base, service those clients that are probably lower down their fee chain, and build those relationships from a much earlier stage, while not compromising the time that your senior staff and expert staff spend with face-to-face meetings. In fact, it frees up their time. So it creates a very different sort of business model where you're much more focused on the client needs, you're much more focused in the way you can target and communicate to your clients. But there are issues around what Jerome was saying about AI and regulation, because we have found in the investment world is that new entrants come, and quite often they sort of slightly bend the rules and the regulations. You're a highly regulated industry, we're a very highly regulated industry. And new entrants who offer technology solutions are not always regulated in the same way and sort of come into the market in a much freer, less baggage, less compliance, less regulation, and are moving quicker than the regulator is or the trade bodies are. And that's something to be very careful of, because again, AI tends to base on backward-looking data and we have found, does have built-in biases, not just for consumers, but actually when you're assessing staff. If you're using AI to assess staff performance and outcomes and contribution to fees, it does have biases in there. So you need to be mindful. But the thing I am most mindful of is the regulation and the keeping step with the technology to ensure that actually clients you're trying to democratize a market and create access, but you don't want to reduce the service that people are being offered and the outcomes. Because yes, we need more businesses, more individuals to be empowered through the access of law and the courts. And I think technology can bring that, but at the same time, you want them to have fair outcomes and not biased outcomes.
Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you all four of you for your introductory comments. What I want to focus a bit more on now is this question of the way in which legal services are delivered and how the way might change. We've seen certainly a catalyst and acceleration of some new technologies. But Jerome, just to come back to you, to what extent is home working or remote working a fundamental change to the business model? Because it seems to me it's still one-to-one consultative advisory service, except we're not meeting in person, we're working from our kitchen tables. I can see, looking longer term, you mentioned AI, that we might move away from the advisory model to some kind of system-based service, essentially productizing and packaging and developing solutions in law. But over the last few months, has the change not simply been an acceleration of a number of technologies you had in place in any event that help you communicate and collaborate more effectively with your clients?
I think it's exactly that, Richard. We, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're luckily investing in innovation and more innovative way of service delivery quite significantly before COVID hit us. So it's applying those technologies and deploying them even faster. I mean, I think the working from home, we are all experiencing it, will be there to stay to a significant extent. I don't think we will get 100% full back to the office anywhere soon, if ever, for a number of reasons, which I think we all can think of. There have been surveys in many professional service industries, so not just legal, which says that only about 20% of people are keen to go back 100% to 5 days a week or more working from the office. I do sometimes, and I'm very much in favor of the working from home flexibility. I was before COVID-19 hit us. At the same time, you do sometimes worry that if it would not return to sort of a better equilibrium, I worry about the training of junior lawyers to human interaction, which I think remains important. Maybe in that sense, I'm a bit old school, being sort of not that old, but in my early 50s, and having just been trained by sitting in a room with someone, I do sometimes fear we would lose that. But at the same time, there's so many benefits that come with it. So I think that pendulum will swing back, but never completely back. And as far as use of technology is concerned, and the idea how much of that will replace what we do as lawyers, I think certainly in certain product areas that Gina was also referring to, there's a sort of a way you can package things or do things in a different way by use also of AI and algorithms. If we get to mature AI and mature algorithms, I think that will definitely happen. I think what will never be replaced is the empathy that one needs as a lawyer, and the human interaction. So I think there will always be a place for that.
And regarding the human interaction, Rosemary, I wasn't trivializing the changes, because I think working from home and collaborating and communicating differently can bring great benefits for clients. But from your point of view, are you missing the face-to-face interaction, or for most purposes is good enough good enough?
I was talking about this with colleagues recently, and we were agreeing that good enough is good enough where you already know the person. I do think it's more difficult where you're starting a relationship and you've only met each other online. I think certainly if taking advice from, particularly around legal issues, if it's important advice, I want to know that I really do trust the person giving that advice, that they do understand me, that we've have built a relationship. And you can do that online, but I think it's quite hard to do. And so there is, I completely agree with what Jeroen was saying. I think in the legal profession, there will always be a need for that human interaction in some shape or form. I think a lot can be done online though, definitely. And one of the things, I run an organization that's across a number of different countries, and we've actually found the fact that we all have to be online levels the playing field in our collaboration and our ways of working together. So in that way, it has been a benefit.
It's interesting because I've spoken to a number of new aspiring players in the legal market, the alternative legal service providers, who are finding it especially difficult in this period, perhaps because, as you say, or as I think as you imply, the existing relationships that where the trust has been built up can be carried through into the electronic world, but it's harder to build a new relationship in this world. So to some extent, this period may favor the longer standing relationships rather than the new players in the block. Gina, in terms of interpersonal relations, do you draw a distinction in wealth management between what I thought you were talking about, which perhaps the higher volume, lower value clients, if I can put them in that way, as opposed to the very high end where the high touch face-to-face service might be preferred? Or do you think the electronic medium applies across the board?
When we launched the platform, we had the perception that we could do it along the lines of wealth, of size of pot, if you like. And
Gina, just jump in for 2 seconds. Just give us 30 seconds on the platform, just to remind us what this is. What
we've done is we've built a fully automated online platform, which means that if someone has, traditional wealth management starts around 500,000, we start at 10,000. But it allows people we do all the money laundering checks, all the onboarding, all the compliance, risk, everything is done online. And then clients can actually choose which portfolios they want to invest in. So we don't give advice, but everything is there laid out in a way that people can self-direct their investment portfolios. But if then they wish to meet us through that process at the beginning, after, whenever, we are always available. But one thing we did discover, we had a perception when we started that it would be the younger clients who would use online, and then maybe the older, more sophisticated clients would want face-to-face meetings. And I have to say, since 2014, that is not the experience that we've had. You can't categorize clients by a particular size or age or other demographic. You actually have to offer the same thing to everybody, and they then decide whether they want to use. We have £2 million clients who come on board themselves, and we never meet them. We have others who have £10,000, and because that's their wealth, and they're very nervous, they want to meet us. So it's not quite as clear cut. But the other thing I was going to say is with the online and the alternative providers coming into a market, there is a perception that you can do it on the cheap almost, that you don't need to have a lot of money to be a successful entrant into a market if you are a modern entrant. And the fact is, you still have to build brand, you still have to build awareness, you still have to communicate with clients and build a relationship and trust with them. So I know that there is this perception that new entrants will be successful. It isn't necessarily a given, that the service might be an efficient service and affordable, but you still have all those other issues to deal with from building a business and building something that's sustainable. So, I tend to say people don't think that every entrant is going to be a threat to your business. It's much better to work together, I think, sometimes, and try and create an industry that has different business models that will service different client needs.
Very helpful. And I think there's a lot we can take there directly into our thinking with the legal market. Judy, I've left for this little session, I've left the most difficult question for last, which is about regulation. We've spoken about this for many years. To what extent, and in the US, of course, you're far more heavily regulated or restrictive than we are in the UK. But to what extent do you perceive the regulatory structure to be an obstacle to innovation and technology and new ways of working?
Dating back to the work of the ABA Commission on the Future of Legal Services, we recognize that lawyers were in their reticence to absorbing change was really causing a problem with regard to innovation and the ability to innovate. And then if you look at the regulatory objectives framework in 2016, that was really meant to allow the 50 Supreme Courts across the country to be able to regulate in a way that was best for their jurisdiction. And that meant regulating legal services in the traditional sense or new types of legal services, new types of delivery mechanisms. And then most recently in February of 2020, our House of Delegates adopted policy for the American Bar that says that we urge states across the country and the regulators across the country to, in fact, consider innovations of all types, including regulatory reform. So if I may go back to Jerome's points earlier, I think it is what we're seeing is an absorption and a willingness to take on new technologies. Of course, the real frontier is whether we're willing to adjust with regulatory reform. And that's where lawyers have to really think about what the change is for, absorb what it's going to be for in terms of what it may mean to them in terms of their practice settings of all different types. But most importantly, what a difference it's going to make for the people they serve. And we expect that out of every profession that we know of, from dentist to oncologist to child's teacher. And we have to have and look at it from that perspective, from where we sit within our profession.
And this is where the subject matter of today's debate, self-interest or public interest, comes in. And it's hard, if you'll forgive me, from a distance not to conclude sometimes that self-interest trumps public interest. Again, if you'll forgive the pun, in the US, where many lawyers hide behind, it seems to me, regulation in restricting access to the market for others. As you heard me say yesterday, I think lawyers should survive and thrive because we bring value that no one else can, not because we regulate others out of the field. That's all I wanted to say or discuss by way of introduction to the notion of COVID-19 and its impact in the legal world. I want to go really in a way to build on the point I and Judy have just been making and ask about something that I have for some years called the grand bargain. And the grand bargain is the arrangement that the professions have with society. It's an arrangement under which we grant various exclusive rights to certain occupational groups, so only they can deliver certain kinds of services. Only a surgeon can cut you open, for example. In most jurisdictions, only a lawyer can appear in the upper courts. But as we have in place this remarkable infrastructure, which is the World Wide Web and the internet, there's new ways of delivering and receiving knowledge and insight and content and advice and service. A question I think the professions have to ask themselves is whether or not there might be different ways of, as it were, democratizing knowledge. If the model that we've relied upon for a few hundred years, when people have medical or legal or accounting or architectural challenges, is to turn to people called professional advisors, it's at least conceivable in years to come, as our machines become increasingly capable, there might be different ways. To what extent then do we see the professions as the benevolent custodians, or are they rather the jealous guards? To what extent should we be encouraging the professions to liberalize and liberate? Gina, would you like to start us off on this one?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're saying about ownership, because again, in our profession, in your professions, this idea that you are the guardians of a particular expertise that people can't own. But actually, the internet has changed all of that, because you have so much more information available to people. And one of the things that I think is really important to think about in this conversation or in this context is the idea of also becoming an educator, because both marketplaces are, as I said, are underserving our client base. But, you know, to have people understand their rights better, especially in the world we're going to go into, where there may well be challenges around workers' rights, about, you know, standards of health, hygiene, whatever it is, to help people understand that their rights and their access to justice not only frees up the courts and can mean that disputes are resolved at a much earlier stage, but it empowers people to be more involved in the law and not seeing the law as being something remote from them that sits at the behest of you know, statutes, or in a courtroom or in a lawyer's office. And that is that's a nurturing relationship for all stakeholders in the sector. And you all benefit from that increased trust that is built that way, increased knowledge and understanding, and also an increase in the idea that you have a societal capital that you're all contributing.
That's fascinating. And is the shift in role from the advisor in a way to the curator as well as the educator, different passing along and immersing people in this case, just how to understand and enforce your entitlements. Judy, I noticed your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick point. I think it is so, Gina is so right, is so much about education. And what we find is that lawyers themselves, even though they live by the rules of our ethics codes in the various states, and we have our ABA model rules of professional conduct, we have to refer them back to the preamble, which actually states that lawyers are public citizens, and that as public citizens, they have to seek to improve the law and the administration of justice, and they have to understand how they can improve the quality of legal services, which includes being mindful of the deficiencies in the administration of justice. Lawyers don't take on that duty themselves often. They leave it to organizations. And as a consequence, I think it is up to lawyers. I think it is up to every law firm to make sure, in legal organizations, I was in-house for 12 years. I can tell you that there are duties there to make sure that individual lawyers understand that they have a role to play in these changes that need to come about for the public.
Jerome, to what extent does this resonate with Clifford Chance? Because after all, you're a huge international organization that advises very large businesses and institutions. Is there, and I don't mean this facetiously, but is there discussions of justice and access to justice? Or quite properly from the point of view of shareholders, are you concerned about delivering a commercial service?
So I actually put my hand up a moment ago, Richard, because I did want to jump in on that. The way you put it in your question, and I mean that in a nice way, but sort of shows where you sit in the debate, because are you either a benevolent contributor or are you a jealous guardian? And I think we'd rather be benevolent and contributors than jealous guardians. And it does go to the point that also Gina made. It's about the education, about partnerships. Now, obviously, and there's truth in that. Of course, as a large commercial law firm, that sort of grand bargain and that monopoly, if you will, benefits us. So you would think on the one hand, we would think, we should guard that indeed jealously. That is not where we are, and that's not where I am in my position. I'll give you an example. You mentioned access to justice. I've seen data that around 5 billion people on this planet do not have really effective access to justice. That is a huge, huge number. And we work together, for example, with an organization which is not so much in the grand commercial sphere where we do our normal day-to-day work, but it's called the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, that you may know about. And we are working with them on the African continent, but also in other countries like the Netherlands or in Ukraine and various countries, to find alternative dispute resolution methods and to give people access to justice, indeed by using technology. So what we do together with Hill, create a fund to help startups, legal tech startups, to find alternative ways, particularly where court systems are not effective or are clogged up or have huge backlogs. So we are very much under our access to justice, which is one of our main strands of our sort of CSR program, and we're trying to bring that more to the center, very much involved in partnerships to try and create alternative ways to help people and to get access to justice, which moves away from that whole monopoly thinking. So I think we're very much open to those partnerships, and I think we need to be, because it also creates that, that trust and that bond that Gina was talking about. And if we lose that, and I think with the technology and what people are experiencing now, I think it will be a natural progression in that direction.
It's interesting again, because it takes us to the question of, in a way, what are lawyers for? I often say of doctors, people don't want doctors, they want health. You could equally say people don't want lawyers, they want, and what's the question? What's the answer to that question? And
well, they want solutions.
Yeah,
they want solutions.
It may be justice, it may be commercial settlements. Rosemary, from your point of view, what's it all about?
Yeah, I loved Gina's description of law being social capital, and that we all have an obligation to build that capital. I thought that was a fabulous description in a microcosm of what the legal profession should be about, and perhaps sometimes is about. I do think the ability to access information about the law is, obviously it's there's more legal information available than ever used to be the case, and it's available with a simple Google search. The challenge is, what do you do with that information when you've got it? How do you actually apply it to the situation that you're in? And I think that's where lawyers still have a very valuable role to play. So it's not quite as easy as just access the information and then you can do it. That jump between here is the information and here is how you apply it, I think is quite a big jump in the legal profession or in the world of law that we have to apply. So my feeling is that we do have an obligation as in-house lawyers. Judy mentioned the world of in-house lawyers, which is a bit different from the world of lawyers working in law firms. We have to try to educate our colleagues as much as possible about legal issues, because there are many more of them than there are of us, and there's lots of legal issues to be sorted out. We can't help them all, so we need them to help themselves and keep themselves out of difficulty as much as possible. So that idea of legal information being a commodity that can be packaged and sold in a way, or used inside an organization, I think is very powerful, but you have to try and do it in a way that makes it usable. And that is not so easy. But inside our own organization, for example, some of my legal team members are doing podcasts around particular aspects of law, particularly things to do with marketing, consumer rights, things that are very visceral for our business colleagues, just to try and help them be aware of the issues that that may come up and be problematic if they're not aware of them already.
In some ways, what you're referring to, I think, is the shift from, as it were, legal information systems where you can retrieve potentially relevant documents to online systems that can actually offer more practical, punchy, actionable help. And at a simple level, that might be a flowchart or a decision tree. At a more advanced level, it'll be a diagnostic expert system or some kind of machine learning-based system. Early days for these technologies, although they're much discussed. We gather together for panelists who we know are interested in reform or interested in innovation and change. The last question I want to ask of you is, who do you think should drive this change? Should it be the market, the clients, the providers, the regulators, governments? Jerome, where would you like to see the drive coming from? Is it down to Clifford Chance, or is it maybe up to Vodafone, as it were?
It's almost, and I don't mean that to duck the question, but it's almost all of the above. Because yes, I do think it should be led by firms like us. We should be driving innovation. We should be driving access to justice and be open to those type of partnerships we spoke about earlier, and not be, protective in that sense. I think that's all right. At the same time, I do think we need regulations behind it and regulators. We heard Judy speak about US regulation. We spoke about AI. I think having, we just had a white paper come out of the European Union on AI. I think if we want to do that in the right way, we need regulators to help drive that. So it is a combination, but I definitely think the market and including large law firms like us should be leading and driving that as well.
Rosemary, do you feel a burden on you, as it were, as a client? Because for many years you have been you've been an advocate for change. Some of that has been about process improvement, but some of it's been about more radical change. Do you feel, does the GFC community feel it's down to them, or is this, as Jerome said, a shared load?
I think it should be and is a shared load, I'm very glad to say. Because I think some clients are interested in the area and want to engage on it. Others are very happy to take the innovations that law firms or other legal practitioners come up with themselves. I think one of the big challenges for a lot of general counsel is now just trying to understand what is out there, what really works, will it work in my particular situation? And that's becoming quite a challenge, but it's a nice problem to have.
Yes, I think it's fair to say, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but there is quite a lot of innovation by press release and quite a lot of hot air, as it were. Is there a sense in the client community that there's less concrete progress in the delivery of services in new ways than the rhetoric suggests?
I would say yes to that.
Cautiously. Okay. Judy, from your point of view, you've been leading the American Bar Association and for a number of years been involved with a number of initiatives to try and modernize and introduce greater innovation in technology, I suppose, across the US. Where would you like to see the drive from? Because one particular issue in the US, you've had the emergence of, I think, a very active group of chief operating officers in legal departments. Is from the UK's point of view, that looks like a very considerable movement. Is that actually shifting the dial in the US?
Yeah, well, I think that the combination of all players involved is critical. They have really contributed mightily, I think, and that's been a very positive thing to get people thinking about where change can happen, not only for the big splashes as you talk about the press releases, but also the incremental change that needs to go forward in every type of place setting where lawyers are at the table. And I think lawyers have to lead it. I think the organized bar has to use its convening power in order to bring players together. I think what we're seeing in the United States in different jurisdictions, whether it be the conversations and discussions going on in California right now on regulatory reform, the regulatory sandboxes that's been created in Utah, in other states like Arizona, where there's really a lot of activity and momentum that's happening. I think those are critical plays that are going on. But there can never be a real sustaining change unless we have at the table from the very beginning consumers of justice. And that is critically important, whether we're talking about commercial consumers of justice, GCs and others, or the individuals, because we need that ownership instilled in everyone who's a part of the change. So I think organized bar, law firms, individual lawyers, general counsel, COOs, as you mentioned, and many more, and also the recognizing that our profession has to look other places to see where successes have been had and where failures have been, in order that we can learn from them and embrace those so that we can do the job better for our profession and for the public.
And Gina, from your point of view, in a different profession, does the drive come from the market, or does the drive come from client demand? I think you were saying earlier, it certainly doesn't come from the regulators.
I think what Judy just said was actually incredibly powerful, but yes, all above, it comes from everyone. But two areas I think we perhaps haven't spoken about. One is, yes, my sector, and also I know to some your lawyers I've been talking to, there are a lot more brochures out there. There's a lot more companies and organizations or corporates talking the talk. But when you then lift the bonnet and actually check how they're working culturally, from mindsets, the staff they're hiring, diversity in their workforce, diversity in their client base, it's not being reflected there. Then you also have to address the fact of training, because if you've got traditional training but expecting innovative outcomes, those two things don't match. You need to go all the way back, and I talk about this in the accountancy world as well, or in my sector, the new trend for ESG that everyone's going on about. But actually, we're not training people to do ESG type accounts or reporting or data collection. So you've got to strip it all the way back and start looking at the education and the training for people going into the workforce, the makeup of the workforce itself, and the makeup of the client base. It's not just about, as you put it, or Jeroen put it, the press release innovations. It's got to be about change at, a prismatic change that comes from all angles of your profession.
Jeroen, you, I think, were wanting to add to the conversation.
Well, yes, thank you, Richard, because in the beginning of my introduction, I talked about, what has been the effect of COVID-19, and the acceleration of acceptance of technology is indeed, the increased pressure also from clients who want to make sure that it's not just, talking to talk, but that there's the actual delivery on it. I think one of the things we also need to be about it is honest. I mean, we've been, as I said, investing in innovation a lot, but we don't have all the solutions. So when we come into clients, we talk about what we can do, what we can't do, we learn together. So it's having that open discussion and honest discussion. I'm also picking up on Rosemary's point about the number of things that are out there and how do you choose what works and what doesn't work. And for example, as a firm, we've invested together with a number of other firms in a platform called Rain and Court, which you may have heard of, which is really trying to collate certain technologies and make sure it is sort of ubiquitous, and we work on that together and partner on it. So it's also a matter of not being jealous guardians of what we discover, but helping clients by collaborating between service providers. So I think it needs that sort of mindset. And last but not least, I'll pick up on what Gina said. I think the education and training point is very important, right from the moment who you select, looking for more, particularly in countries like the UK, where there's not the 6 years legal training, but you can have a different pre-training. We look for a lot of STEM trained lawyers now with that technology affinity and interest, and then we have to deliver on that in the training. So it goes, you have to strip it indeed right back to that as well. And then adaptation is sometimes slower than one would like, also in a big organization, but it's certainly being accelerated, what we see in 2020.
Thank you. And I think it's time now for questions from those who are listening and watching. Jennifer, if you can join us again. I'm hoping you've been gathering together, pulling them together into a seamless tapestry.
I have indeed, and some really fantastic questions and probing, and also some real ideas that are coming through also through the Q&A. So one topic that seems to be resonating very strongly is the piece around the societal capital to which we're all contributing. And one particular question from Kieran Fenton on this. He says, Section 412 of the recently published Independent Review of Legal Services Regulation was critical of the current regulation of law departments, so in-house in businesses, and the consequent risk to society. Does the panel feel that COVID-19 may accelerate changes in legal services regulation because organisations, many of whom have taken advantage of COVID financing, wish to improve their ESG behaviour, and more independent in-house environment might assist in that ESG-based decision making? So this exploring further, and I know, Gina, you mentioned it, exploring further whether this is an impetus towards ESG behaviour overall and the role of in-house in that.
Okay, thank you. Gina, did you want to respond to that? And perhaps Rosemary after that?
I think when it comes to this expectation from the consumer, because if we look at it, people are much more aware now of what is your purpose, what is your role in society, what are your values, what are your contributions. And I think if businesses aren't alert to that, and not just from tick boxing of it, but actually being able to live and breathe and deliver it, the clients will go elsewhere. So there's a much more consciousness, I think, among consumers for values that are embedded in an organization. And that's, I suspect, will be exactly the same for law firms. But on the ESG side of it, there is this whole idea that you have to also deliver to sort of a triple bottom line or an ESG, but it's not that simple. It will take time. It's not going to happen overnight because it requires all parts of your business to be looking at innovation, retraining, where the skills gaps might be. So the direction of travel, I think, is profound, but we won't get there with a lot of resources and investment and strategic input and real longer term thinking. And this is only for 2 to 3 years. So it's going to require a lot of sort of shoulders to the mill, if it were, to create long-term sustainable change.
I suppose that also goes for some of the changes we've seen because of COVID. I think there's a difference between the ad hoc, for example, in the court system, the ad hoc changes that have been put in place, difference between that and industrializing it so it's actually sustainable for a long period of time. So in a way, what we're seeing, I often think here, is it's almost like an unscheduled pilot. We're seeing the exploration of a whole bundle of different phenomena and acceleration, but it doesn't mean that the kinds of wholesale change you're talking about is going to be bedded in with 2 or 3 months, many years, I think, culturally, technically, and so forth. Rosemary, did you have anything to follow up on? Because I think there was a mention of a regulation, and I'm afraid I can't quote, a criticism of in-house legal departments, I think.
Yes, I have to say there seems to be an assumption in some parts of academia that if you're an in-house lawyer, you somehow left your morals at the door when you went through the portal marked so-and-so and company limited. Nothing could be further from the truth in my experience. And lawyers who have been through a professional qualification, whether they end up at the bar, in a law firm, in an alternative legal services practice, in-house, or doing something that isn't a legal activity at all, should be carrying with them the standards and professional and ethical standards that they learnt during their training. If they are not learning it through their training, that's a problem. And that goes back to Gina's comment about train carefully for the future that you want. But I would say that the in-house legal teams that I know are doing everything they can to ensure that the clients that they're serving, i.e. the companies that employ them, are sustainable for the long term. Frankly, it's in their own interests to make sure that's the case, as well as the interests of all their fellow employees. Nobody wants to be part of a company that goes out of business, whether because of a reputational crisis or because they've actually done something unlawful. So the role of a lawyer in-house clearly is connected to the ideals of ESG in terms of strong governance, sustainability, and I think increasingly lawyers are becoming aware of environmental issues as well. So I would have said that in-house lawyers are well placed. They are by no means alone. I completely agree with Gina that companies and organizations are increasingly aware that ESG simply equals good business, apart from being essential for the longevity of our civilization. And therefore, in-house lawyers have that role to play. They are, I think, already playing it today, and I'm not sure they need any further regulation to encourage them to do so. Thank
you. Well spoken. Jennifer, another clutch of questions.
Yes, absolutely. And actually on that point, that part of the legal services independent review was actually suggesting that in-house counsel should have additional support available to them to enable them to fulfill all of the aspects that Rosemary, you just shared. So actually it was very much in support of in-house. There's another piece following on from this, which is around the how. So people want to move into, okay, this all sounds like the right direction of travel. How? So how do we encourage greater innovation in the sector? Potentially if there are regional changes or success factors that we could draw on. For example, Daniel Ryan asked if there's a regional difference, how can the UK accelerate innovation together? And then there's a whole thread of questions which want to talk to specific types of technology and how it can serve. For example, certain aspects of AI, certain aspects, other elements such as automated speech recognition, smart contracts, etc. So a piece around the how, please, for the audience.
So, Jeroen, there's no need to dip down into the specific technologies, but it'd be great to hear how it is that Clifford Chance goes about gathering together its innovators, capturing ideas, and exploiting emerging and monitoring emerging technologies?
Yes, thanks for that question, Richard. I want to be quite careful to talk too much, how great we're doing all this stuff, and it becomes like a sales pitch. But as you ask, the way we've tried to do that now for a number of years is in 3 strands. So one, we have something called Create, then we've got something called Clifford Chance Applied Solutions, and then we have Best Delivery. Create is really about what you would call scaling the new, and seeing how we can change delivery models, work together with academia, work together with startups, really sort of create the thinking, the blue sky thinking. Then Clifford Chance Applied Solution is a legal tech subsidiary, which is a standalone entity, but a subsidiary of Clifford Chance, where we develop our own products, whether it's around tools for due diligence, around data protection, around smart contracting, which we then license, which is a licensing model. And we in some of these products are a great success, others less so, and we learn as we go along. And finally, Best Delivery is how we deliver our services. So in terms of having the resource managers, using the tools ourselves in the way we deliver. So I have this, I could go on for a long time, I won't, but that's how we try and capture that. And then, well, maybe last but not least is by seeking partnerships and seeking to work together, both with our clients, but also with other law firms. I mentioned this Rain and Court thing, which is like a platform which brings together technologies. We invested in it right from the start, together with Latham's and Watkins, US firm. Now there's many firms signed up to it, and that's trying to create products where general counsel are helped to see the tree through the woods, or whatever the expression is, or the wood through the trees, I think it is, and to actually, how do you find out within that whole Scala product what actually works, and work together on that. So that is part of the how, and it's a journey. It's learning as we go along, but it is really a matter of significant investment. So we appointed a head of innovation and Best Delivery a couple of years ago. And we've invested significantly in people and resources to scale the new, so to speak.
And in that respect, so similar to many other industries, consumer electronics, pharmaceutical industries, you need continually to be rethinking what your products and services are. I think the main takeaway there is it's a managed process, and it's a process that's attracted a great deal of investment, whereas maybe a decade ago it was more random where the innovations would arise from. Judy, you've probably seen inside more law firms in the United States than many. Are there any particular tips or insights you can share with us from your exposure to so many law firms and lawyers and in-house legal departments that are trying to grapple with technology and innovation?
I think there has to be an embrace of what corporations across the country and across the world do all the time, which is invest in R&D, in essence. I mean, I was in the aerospace and defense industry for those dozen years, and there is a significant investment in R&D. And lawyers and law firms don't often look at things that way. They certainly have not looked in the past at innovation. To hear leader firms like Jerome's, Clifford Chance, to know that they are taking that investment seriously, not only for their own benefit, but with a client's lens on it, is critically important. And that will make a difference in what you see, because that creates what I call not only collaboration, but a healthy competition among who can be the best, just like we want to see that in every aspect of services we get outside of the profession. So yes, there are some exciting things happening at different law firms across the country. Some of those are partnerships with the organized bar. Other ones are firms joining together, as Jerome noted. And sometimes it's even more of a risk taker than that. And that is someone saying, we're going to try this type of innovation, whether it be technological or in a delivery mechanism, as a pilot in a jurisdiction, in a court, particularly, to a particular kind of court, and we're going to see what happens. And if it happens, then we're going to replicate and really make sure that we bring it somewhere else that has the ability to really leverage and get it out more broadly. So they are, in essence, sharing. And one program I'll tell you about is a program we have at the ABA Center for Innovation, where we had tech companies come together, and they are taking their tech platforms, which they are selling commercially, and they have an MOU with us at the Center for Innovation, where every time they make those sales, they are actually taking that platform and giving that technology to legal services corporation offices across the country, and utilizing the ABA to help them do that. So they're making that commercial sale, and then they're coming and delivering it to the legal aid side, part of the community's needs. And that is, I think, a brilliant way to make sure that they're getting their product out there, but they're also doing good.
Thank you for that. Jennifer, I'm conscious of time. We have about 5 minutes left. And so with that in mind and hoping to give each panelist a final opportunity to speak, are there a third set of questions you can share with us?
This perhaps is a quick one, and there's a whole category here around access to justice and this question of how do we do that? How do we go from here to that? And one from Nikki Clegg, which perhaps sums it up. What's the biggest barrier we can change that's blocking greater equality to access to legal services in the UK? So perhaps the panel's view on number one obstacle, if they could go after one, what would they choose?
And this is in the context of access to justice. Gina, did you want to start off with this? You've been a user of legal services, legal background yourself, but from your point of view, what is the major obstacle to people being able to understand and enforce their entitlements in this country?
I think in the UK, it's got to be the cutback in legal aid. Affordability is a huge problem for people, be it SMEs and people, because without affordability, they won't have access to justice. As much as you can educate somebody. And I think if you look at some of the research that's been done by the Online Dispute Resolution Advisory Council, they're saying it's about empowering. So you develop what's called a preventative philosophy. So you help people to prevent something escalating. So you then need to have an expensive lawyer or go to the courtroom or approach the court. So it's maybe developing that mindset of a preventative philosophy, using the law in that way.
Thank you. Rosemary?
I completely agree with Gina. I do think automation, AI in the courts does have a role to play for some levels of justice. But I completely agree with what Gina was saying about legal aid in particular. I think we lost something of real value in this country when we reduced legal aid so drastically. Huge damage was done.
And this is not to justify it, but I think it is true to say that the reduction in public funding is a global phenomenon as well. So the access to justice challenge is a global challenge. OECD figures are only 46% of people in the world have realistic access to legal advice and to court services. And it seems to me, and I say this again and again, but it's something of which we should be collectively ashamed. And it's something that it requires greater funding, but also I think requires us to rethink how it is we can, for example, use technology to offer greater access. I often say more people now have access to the internet than have access to justice. Judy.
I think the number one barrier is, frankly, a lack of understanding among the legal profession globally that creating and designing and affording new means of access to justice does not necessarily mean a threat to what we do in the traditional practice of law. There is such a huge need for access to justice that we have to understand that if we have not been able to meet that need, our obligation, our duty as lawyers is to make sure that it's met. And that means understanding what more we can do in order to make sure those who need us are served and who need ways to get to justice.
Thank you. Jeroen, very quickly, if you can take us home on this one. Major obstacle that you perceive to access to justice?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to go specifically into the UK, but just at a global level. I mean, I think, coming out of the COVID crisis, there is a concern that access to justice. I mean, we all worry primarily about healthcare and about PPEs, et cetera, and that's rightly so. But I would put in number two, not far behind that, concerns around, lack of access to justice, maybe going backwards sometimes, in if you see how what the response is sometimes. I'm really concerned about the number of people, and you mentioned a percentage, that don't have adequate access to justice. And I think as lawyers, we should remember why we became lawyers. And it's not just for, the commercial work we do. It is about the rule of law. It is about supporting the rule of law and helping people with access to justice. And I spoke about things we're doing in cooperation, for example, with that Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, which is all about what technological solutions and what solutions can we find to grant people access to justice where the court systems are maybe too slow, too expensive, lawyers are too expensive. There are other solutions. And I think we should build partnerships and private to public partnerships and partnerships between, private practices and civil society to really build on that. And there's lots of opportunities there, and there's funding that we need to create for that.
I think that's a great note to end on. Judy, Gina, Jeroen, and Rosemary, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an action-packed hour. Jennifer, back to you to close things officially. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And perhaps a call to action at the end there to bring the rule of law to life in our everyday, in whichever circumstances we are practicing. So thank you from me also to our fantastic panelists and for the discussion. To Richard for his great work as our chair, thank you. And to all of you for attending and for the great questions. I'd also like to thank the team at TechNation who have brilliantly enabled this event to happen. We will be sharing the recording of this session and that of the first debate, so you can keep an eye out for that. I would also very much value your feedback on today's discussion, in particular, the key takeaways for you, what's on your mind, further questions. And so please do share that with us when we send a follow-up email to you. We're at the beginning of our work programme as LawTech UK, and many of the topics that we've explored today and at last week's debate are very much front of mind for us. And we look forward to helping shape the transformation of the legal sector through technology alongside many of you tuning in today. So many thanks again to you all, and goodbye.